Hey everyone, it's Alex, and today I wanted to talk about Asian authors. I'd planned to do this video in May during Asian American Pacific Islander Heritage Month, but given recent events, I wanted to put this up now. A few days ago in Atlanta, Georgia, a 21-year-old white man opened fire on 8 people, and 6 of them specifically being Asian women. The assailant claimed that his specific reasoning behind this was based on this overpowering sexual urge towards these women. On top of also hearing a police officer say that he's sympathizing with the murderer by calling it a bad day, it only, I think, reinforces the general perspective of the suffering of people of color. That this tragedy towards Asian people is only just a reinforcement of the context of America's history. Evident from America's past with the Chinese Exclusion Act and also Japanese internment camps as past examples, with I would say as the most modern contribution being that, of course, with Donald Trump, with the coronavirus, calling it things like the Chinese virus. Among the violence with people of color in general having grown this past year, especially with everything going on with the Black community and the Black Lives Matter movement, with the Asian community, the rate has exponentially grown of violence towards Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders. No doubt due to the rhetoric of things like what Trump says about calling COVID a Chinese virus, but only showing, I think, that representation is so important based on the type of information we absorb, whether what we watch or what we hear, or maybe even possibly ways in which we can expose what we read. Not only that, but also understanding that the term Asian or Asia is really so broad, as maybe people may think of East Asia, like with Japan or China, but also we have South and Southeast Asia as examples. Even thinking inwardly of trying to think the outside looking in of what the perspective is of thinking of what it means to be Asian American is still something I'm learning. Where I grew up in Appalachia, it was a state of trying to realize with my mom's best intentions of her sort of molding me and my siblings under the model minority myth, hoping that if we can grow ourselves into being around white peers, it can also make us have these more white lives. But that same whiteness that my mom was maybe trying to model us for or after is on the basis of an area in the States that's not even generally opportunistic. Only emphasizing the disparity of maybe how Asian American stories like mine are maybe always trying to reach this impossible pedestal, expanded upon the desire of a whole history of Asians and Asian Americans trying to support their families to get to where we are now, only for the rug to be pulled out from underneath them for someone having a so-called bad day. Today I wanted to share some Asian author and book recommendations that I read that I wasn't really expecting to have this solace from. Because it really wasn't until moving away from Appalachia to where I live now, where it's much more diverse and I see more people in general that just look like me, that I really wasn't aware of the representation I was looking for, that I feel like in a way books kind of helped me with getting those first steps into recognizing that. Up first, I wanted to mention Interpreter of Maladies by Jhumpa Lahiri. This short story collection was really in a way the blueprint or the first steps of me realizing I could find stories where I felt I was represented. With Lahiri, with this collection, she primarily writes about these stories of people having an immigrant experience. Lahiri herself being a child of immigrant parents, where both of her parents are from India. Other than being wonderfully written, I think this collection really does help introduce immigrant narratives, but also being familiar enough to people that might recognize that same familiarity. As the characters in here try to honor their past and also their present and future with what it feels like to be in this in-between of somewhere you come from and somewhere like America, where it feels like there's always this contrast to compare to. If you're a fan of short stories, definitely check this one out. Up next I have In the Country by Mia Alvar, and I picked this one up because Alvar is Filipino-American, so many of the characters are Filipino or Filipino-American. Whether set in the Philippines or maybe somewhere like the States, I feel like these stories really had a great effect on me of really reminding me this pattern that Alvar writes about how to secure one's family. The characters in here feel like limbs to each other in a way, kind of really focused on the concept of memory and nostalgia, trying to live up to their ideas of personal success, but also like familial or family success based on years of building relationships between what success means across generations. I also like that Alvar gave some concepts of characters that endure a sense of labor in their relationship with labor, kind of reinforcing the notion of how one's labor is the contribution to supporting one's family, not only like the nuclear family, but also frequently at least thinking of like Filipino identity, of how, at least from what I can speak to, the idea of always supporting your family back home in your home country. In terms of the writing with this book, I would say that the stories sometimes fall flat for me, mainly because I feel like the characters are a little bit too stuck in their mind to where they feel more passive than like pensively thinking about stuff. But overall, it was a great experience to read some writing that felt so familiar to me in terms of place and just stories in general. Similarly, with Filipino stories, I have a memoir, and that is The Body Papers by Grace Talusan. Talusan navigates her memory of remembering growing up in the Philippines, but now she is reflecting on it upon living in the States. And I feel like what Talusan captured really well is maybe this unconscious or unintended guilt or burden of carrying the weight of one's success dependent on what they can do for their family. Having Talusan be this generation that's able to live in the States and on the basis of satisfying the family past of sort of that ideal dream of the American dream. But alongside that, Talusan has her own sense of traumas with her past, especially in relationship with her family, and how that really causes literal physical illness, but also some mental duress as well. Also nicely added in here is some mixed media of Talusan, including some old photographs and documents from her family. So this book feels like a really big homage, how she is a symbol of her family wishing upon this for so long. And again, kind of that relationship between what that means for her specifically and how she's able to help realize that dream. So within that same concept of maybe the American dream, I also wanted to talk about Saigon by Phuc Tran. This is a memoir about Tran moving with his family from Vietnam to Pennsylvania as he's experienced to these stepping stones of American pop culture. Specifically, Tran tells us about things like books and music that he liked throughout his adolescence, but what he's really doing is giving us this growing relationship between his loss of his Asian identity and his growing interpretation about what it means to be American. He's able to end chapters in like this really 101 reflecty kind of prose, but where it becomes so familiar to end chapters that way, it really does also grow in maturity as well. And with that sense of growth in Tran's writing, it also shows about he's also catching up and realizing sort of the bigger themes of life, about maybe, for example, understanding his parents' conflict with missing their home life in Vietnam, but also trying to adjust to American life. So yeah, I really love this. It's one of my favorite books and one of my favorite memoirs, and I think it really talks well about that sense of culture clash between Asian American identity. Speaking of some parent/son culture clash, I also wanted to talk about On Earth We're Briefly Gorgeous by Vuong. This is a work of fiction about a young man named Little Dog as he moves with his mother from Vietnam to Connecticut in the States. I have a separate review of this on my channel if you want to go check that out for my full thoughts, but I would barely call it a review or be hesitant to call it that. It's a rare moment in my reading life where I've become attached to a book, and not even from a sense of like really loving it or anything, but the book just had like too many personal beats for reflecting my personal life. That was a bit eerie. But what I really liked about, like, conceptually about this book, which I would say is its most successful aspect based on its like ideas, is that Little Dog, his intention is that his mother, since being illiterate, is a way I felt like of Vuong being able to rebuild that sense of what it can now mean to be American based on helping communicate with his mother. So it does cause Little Dog to kind of use his mother as like a vehicle of being a mirror to his own experience of now trying to adjust to this new life growing up in Connecticut while also enduring a same-sex relationship on top of everything else. So yeah, it's a book where I really like the ideas, but I just wish the execution was a bit better, especially with the writing, because I felt it was a bit too flowery for me, which isn't usually my vibe. But I did hear that Vuong, I think, is coming out with, is it a novel? I think a new novel, so I'm definitely gonna pick that up too. Up next, I have Severance by Ling Ma, which was a beginning pandemic favorite since it's also about a pandemic. At the center of this pandemic, we have Candace Shen, who's a 20-something Asian American working in publishing in New York City. Otherwise, Candace also has an interest in photography, which I thought was so interesting because I think between photography and publishing, they're both creative processes that ultimately value the product over the process. Being that the creative process and Candace's interest being the symbol of sort of the collective approach to identity versus the actual end result or the jobs that Candace is working as being a symbol of the individualistic society that America is popularly known for. But it's kind of interesting because Candace is actually spared of the virus from where we catch up with her whenever all of this is happening. I think maybe being a symbol of just how Asian Americans are always in this sense of preparedness, living in this imaginary dystopia of navigating either being not Asian enough or maybe being too American. I think this is one of those books I was maybe just reading too much into, but I did like how it made me think, and I think it was a fun ride and even made me more of an anti-capitalist. And finally, we're ending on another nonfiction work, and that's Minor Feelings by Cathy. Between all the books I'm talking about today, this one is definitely the most rooted in researched topics about Asian American history and citations of violence against Asian Americans specifically. Hong cites some microaggressions specifically and largely how Asian Americans may feel being under the radar of things like violence that only perpetuate kind of the stereotype more of things like Asians and Asian Americans being docile and obedient under the model minority myth. Or also with this unfortunate tragedy that happened in Atlanta with these Asian women, how Asian Americans are, especially women, are given this perception of being in this fantasy to where they're fetishized. Through reading Minor Feelings essays, it felt like I was still reading this private secret of something I wasn't aware that could be made public, which really made me think about where exactly the origin of my conception of private and public experience being Asian American came from. Probably especially from Western TV that I grew up watching, where Asian Americans are usually just the sidekick or being performative to where they don't even seem to be, or they're forced to act like they have difficulty with English proficiency. And I do realize it's up to me to ultimately continue my own self-education in Asian and Asian American identity, but also kind of look under the bigger umbrella of the overt and subtle ways in which people of color are oppressed. In the description box below, I plan to put some resources to some AAPI initiatives. I know since we're bookish people, also some links to some Asian American bookstores. Obviously, I'm no expert in Asian or Asian American stuff or identity or whatever. I would be most interested if you have any book recommendations from Asian authors. I would love to hear those as well. As always, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.